Good evening and thanks for joining us. The top stories today. President Trump released a nationwide plan for ending suicides among veterans. He says it will empower them with the best prevention practices. An Atlanta police officer is now charged with felony murder after he shot a suspected drunk driver. The driver was resisting arrest at the time. The incident has already set off riots in Atlanta. Republican senators introduced a police reform bill aimed at making it safer for both suspects and police. Senator Tim Scott and others want to push the bill into law quickly. Home mortgage applications are at an 11-year high despite economic uncertainty. It comes as mortgage rates hit historic lows. And a Chinese social media giant now owns a piece of Warner Music. The move comes after buying stakes in other industry giants like Universal and Spotify. But what ties does it have with the Chinese communist regime? The Trump administration is launching a public awareness campaign this year to end suicides among veterans. The move is part of the Prevents roadmap, which the president says aims to end the national tragedy.
The president says they're launching a plan to end the national tragedy of veteran suicide, all part of the Prevents roadmap. For one, he says the Prevents task force plans to let veterans and the country know that something can be done to help.
We'll launch a national public awareness campaign in the coming months. This historic campaign will mobilize every sector of American society to encourage heroes in need, empower them with the best prevention practices.
The Veterans Affairs Task Force says an average of 17 veterans committed suicide every day in 2017. Solving this issue is the VA's main task. President Trump underlined that little is known about the phenomena and that the task force will launch a national research strategy to better understand what can be done to effectively help at-risk veterans. One former Marine and Coast Guardsman shared that faith got him out of that dark place in the aftermath of an incident during the Iraq War.
I felt there was no one I could turn to, that my life just wasn't worth living. As a tough Marine, I was hesitant to seek the help I truly needed to recover. 2009, by God's grace and mercy, I was saved by Jesus Christ.
The number of yearly veteran suicides has jumped overall since 2006. 2017 saw a bump up since 2016. The VA says it's building relationships with different institutions in society to share best practices and make sure they know what resources they have to help veterans.
The Atlanta police officer who shot a man dead in a Wendy's parking lot has now been charged with murder. The incident has sparked riots in the city, including the burning of buildings.
The Atlanta police officer who shot a man in a Wendy's parking lot is facing a felony murder charge. Fulton County District Attorney Paul Howard made the decision after concluding that 27-year-old Rayshard Brooks did not pose a threat of death or serious injury to the officers. According to Georgia law, an officer can only use deadly force if death or serious injury could result to himself or others. Brooks was found asleep in his car and was questioned by officers. He was shot twice in the back after resisting arrest and attempting to run away with one of the officers' tasers. He turned around as if to fire it when one of the officers shot him. The officer then kicked Brooks and offered no medical treatment to the dying man. Brooks was the father of 4 children.
Senate Republicans introduced a 106-page bill on police reform today. The senators say they hear the cries for change around the country and are hoping to get the legislation passed as soon as possible.
Senate Republicans introduced police reform legislation. The 106-page Justice Act includes police accountability, banning chokeholds, and more. Senator Tim Scott introduced the legislation and shared his own experience of being stopped by police.
And we find ourselves at a place with a package that I think speaks to the families that I spoke with yesterday who lost loved ones. We hear you. I think this package speaks very clearly to the young person who's concerned when he's stopped by the law enforcement officers. We see you.
Scott said the legislation would create greater safety for both suspects and police. Scott also addressed the fact that the government's not getting certain data from local law enforcement necessary to make policy decisions. The senators were adamant about getting the new policing reforms passed quickly and urged their Democratic Party colleagues to come together and not delay legislation.
And our Democratic friends, if they want to make a law and not just try to make a point, I hope they'll join us in getting on the bill and trying to move forward in the way the Senate does move forward when it's trying to actually get an outcome rather than just sparring back and forth.
The bill will be addressed in the Senate next week. Democrats in the House are preparing to advance their own legislation to a floor vote expected by July 4th.
New York State lawmakers announced the passing of sweeping police reform bills. The reforms make sure that people who are arrested get medical aid if they need it. The laws also make police misconduct records public. Some of the bills received bipartisan support. NTD's Kevin Hogan has more.
And I'm very happy he's here today. He was a big help and a big push.
New York State lawmakers announced the passage of landmark criminal justice and police reform bills. Senator Jamal Bailey said the reforms would allow the Attorney General to investigate cases of police killings when the suspect is unarmed, among other things.
And you may have seen something about the repeal of 50A. That ensures that we no longer will have a bar on these disciplinary records, and that in case of a bad act by an officer that the public has the right to know, we will now be able to find that information out.
Last week, Governor Andrew Cuomo signed sweeping police reform bills into law. The move bans police from using chokeholds and requires officers to get medical aid for arrestees who need it. Assemblywoman Natalia Fernandez sponsored that bill.
A constituent from the Bronx was in their custody having a heart attack, begging for help, and was ignored and was mocked. And I feel my legislation would remind them that there will be consequences for such malice, attitude, and neglect.
In 2017, a Bronx man died in police custody from a heart attack after police ignored his plea for help. His widow speaks about the abuse.
Each and every time that he stated that he needed a medical attention, Officer Mark Weeks failed to call the ambulance, to radio on his recorder and give him the medical attention that he needed. He died 1 minute before he got to the police station, and you see this all on dash cam.
New York Senator Sepulveda is chairman of the Corrections Committee. He said he plans to propose a bill that would take away the pension from any officer who engages in police brutality and is convicted.
We don't want the same situation that happened in Minneapolis, where Officer Chauvin, or Mr. Chauvin, I refuse to call him an officer, despite causing the death of Mr. Floyd, will inherit a pension for approximately $1 million during his lifetime.
Some NYPD officers have said some lawmakers have gone too far with the reforms, as police are already in danger, given what has been seen in the recent violent riots. They said sometimes to do their job they need to use force, but now they are afraid to do so out of fear of losing their jobs. 5 of the 42 Republicans in the New York Assembly voted across party lines in support of Fernandez's bill. Kevin Hogan, NTD News, New York.
And Pepsi is changing the name and logo of its breakfast brand Aunt Jemima. The company says it's acknowledging the brand's race-related origins and will make the change by the end of this year.
PepsiCo is planning to change both the name and logo of its breakfast food brand Aunt Jemima, a pancake mix and syrup line that's been in business for over 130 years. The company said it acknowledges the brand's origins. It also said that updating the image over the years to be less offensive wasn't enough. Distinguished Professor of American Studies Devarian Baldwin says that in his view, the Aunt Jemima brand has allowed for certain stereotypes to survive.
So Aunt Jemima is directly a part of that whole era of racial nostalgia, longing for images of Black people in servitude at a time when they were fighting against that very condition.
Baldwin agrees with changing the brand, saying that the images have influence over how people treat and perceive others. He suggests that PepsiCo and other companies present images that would have a positive effect on society.
The advertising for consumer goods, they give us images of the world we want. They're not just selling goods, they're selling an idea, selling a narrative. And so in the basic spirit of advertising, and given the current climate, put out images to sell products based on the world that we want.
PepsiCo announced a set of initiatives worth more than $400 million over 5 years to support Black communities and boost Black representation within its company.
The Trump administration is suing a former national security advisor over his memoir. Former advisor John Bolton says the book has explosive information about his time in the White House, but the administration says it also contains classified information.
The Trump administration has filed a lawsuit to block former National Security Advisor John Bolton from publishing his memoir. The White House says the book still contains classified information and could present a national security threat. President Trump says he thinks the book is inappropriate.
I will consider every conversation with me as president highly classified. So that would mean that if he wrote a book and if the book gets out, he's broken the law. And I would think that he would have criminal problems. I hope so.
The lawsuit comes 1 week before the book was supposed to be published. Bolton said in a statement that his book has explosive details of his time in the White House. The Attorney General says people who come to work in the government have to sign an agreement. Any writings they do after they leave have to be cleared first.
If they write something that draws on or might reflect some of the information they've had access to, they have to go through a clearance process before they can publish the book. And we don't believe that Bolton went through that process.
In the lawsuit, the Justice Department requested the court declare the book a violation of the non-disclosure agreement. The publisher said the Trump administration is trying to quash publication of a book it deems unflattering to the president. The DOJ says divulging classified information is a federal crime.
The U.S. is imposing sweeping sanctions targeting Syria's president. It aims to choke off revenue for his government in a bid to force it to back UN-led negotiations and broker a deal to end the country's nearly decade-long war. Syria has already been under US and EU sanctions that have frozen the assets of the state and hundreds of companies and individuals. Washington already bans export and investment in Syria by Americans, as well as transactions involving oil and hydrocarbon products. But the new sanctions can freeze the assets of anyone dealing with Syria, regardless of nationality, and cover many more sectors. It also targets people dealing with entities from Russia and Iran, President Bashar al-Assad's main backers. In other news, mortgage applications for new homes are at an 11-year high. Mortgage rates are at historic lows as the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates to help the economy through the pandemic.
Despite the economic uncertainty around the pandemic, home mortgage applications are at an 11-year high. They're up 21% compared to the same period last year. The surge in demand comes as mortgage rates are at historic lows. The rate for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage has dropped to 3.3% compared to almost 4% last year. Refinancing has also become more popular. Applications are up 106% on last year. People want to lock in lower repayment rates. The Federal Reserve is helping by keeping its benchmark rate close to zero. It's an effort to lift the economy through low-cost credit. And Fannie Mae says mortgage rates might be heading even lower. The Mortgage Association says the annual average rate for 2020 will be 3.2% and will fall to 2.9% next year.
Up next, a Chinese internet giant now owns part of Warner Music. With the deal, the company now has stakes in two of the world's three biggest music labels. But the company has a track record of facilitating surveillance for Beijing.
Just how is the Chinese regime forcing nations to choose between the China and American models and punishing countries like Australia and the UK that fail to comply with its demands? How is the Chinese Communist Party exploiting the protests and riots in America following the killing of George Floyd for propaganda? And how has the concept of racism in America been altered by far-left radical groups to fuel the race equivalent of communist class struggle? In this episode, we sit down with Joshua Phillip, an award-winning investigative reporter at the Epoch Times and the host of the show Crossroads. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek.
Chinese authorities say the virus outbreak situation in Beijing is escalating. Over 350,000 people have been tested so far, and results are starting to come in. NTD's Tiffany Meyer has the details.
According to Chinese state-run media, over 350,000 people in Beijing have been tested for the CCP virus so far. More than 100 of them have tested positive. But these numbers cannot be independently verified, and the Chinese Communist Party has been known to grossly underreport virus cases. Images of Beijing citizens waiting to get tested have prompted concern of cross-infection. Chinese authorities say the situation is still escalating. About 60% of flights from Beijing have been canceled, most of them domestic. All neighborhoods in the city have been or will be put under lockdown. The tactic is part of what's called Warning Level 1, the highest alert in virus epidemic warning systems. Yet so far, China only announced Warning Level 2 for its capital city. One Beijing citizen who lives close to the Xingfadi market posted a call for help on social media. Xingfadi market is the source of the second outbreak cluster. He wrote that since last weekend, his neighborhood has been under overall lockdown. That means no one is allowed to leave the house to go shopping. In the beginning, residents could use an app to buy things online. But roads are now blocked and delivery vehicles can't enter the neighborhood. Residents are left with only one option: to help each other. No volunteers or official aid workers have brought food or other necessities to the neighborhood for 5 days. The Citizen Aid hotline is also not reachable. As a last resort, the netizens appeal to others online in an effort to get authorities' attention. One netizen commented that families should stockpile food and supplies in advance. They added that the regime's fake news harms people and expressed hope that through the pandemic, people will wake up to what's going on. Another netizen noted that Chinese state media has been extensively reporting about the protests and riots in the U.S. They wrote that ironically, the Chinese regime cares about the Black Lives Matter issue in the U.S., but has not time to take care of its own people. This week, Chinese human rights lawyer Yu Wenshen was sentenced to 4 years in prison for inciting subversion of state power. 2 years ago, Yu published an article online titled "Recommendation for Constitutional Amendment." In it, he suggested holding an election to decide the president of the state, among other ideas. 1 day later, he was arrested. Yu's wife told us she hadn't been informed of her husband's court process. Instead, she received a phone call from the prosecutor's office after the proceedings to inform her of the result. She was also told that her husband wants to appeal to the court's decision. As early as 2014, Yu was detained for 99 days because of his support for democratic movements in Hong Kong. He was tortured while in custody. Following his release, he joined the China Human Rights Lawyers Group, where he represented many Falun Gong practitioners, prisoners of conscience, and other arrested human rights lawyers. Falun Gong is a spiritual meditation discipline that has been persecuted in China for over 20 years. Last month, Yu's wife published a video online asking the international community to demand that the Chinese regime immediately release her husband. In the video, she said she'll never give up.
China's social media giant just bought a piece of Warner Music. It's an important move for its overseas expansion, but the company has a track record of facilitating Beijing's surveillance. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
A Chinese tech giant under the thumb of the Chinese Communist regime now owns a piece of Warner Music. This June, China's Tencent bought an almost 2% stake in the world's third largest music company, Warner Music Group. While it doesn't look like a big piece of the pie, the move is still significant for the overseas expansion of the Chinese internet conglomerate. With the deal, it now owns minority stakes in 2 of the world's 3 biggest record labels. Just 3 months ago, Tencent bought 10% of the world's largest music company, Universal Music Group. The company has the option to increase the stake to as much as 20%. Universal is home to big names such as Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber. Aside from record labels, Tencent also owns 9% of Spotify, the music streaming giant. But Tencent is also a company that has a track record of helping the ruling party to spy on its own people. It owns China's largest social network, WeChat. The platform boasts over 1 billion monthly active users around the world. The app's soaring popularity gives the company a treasure trove of data to which Chinese authorities have access to, including deleted messages. Under the Chinese law, internet companies have to hand over user data if regime officials want it. Also, in big internet companies like Tencent, China's authorities have stationed web police, whose job it is to crack down on information the regime deems harmful. The state calls these rumors. One such example is whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang. Last December, before China's authorities admitted the existence of the CCP virus, he warned his colleagues about it in a WeChat group. 4 days later, he ended up in a local police station. He was reprimanded for spreading false rumors on the internet. Li later caught the virus himself and died 4 months before his son was born. For the app's overseas users, politically sensitive posts may not land you in a Chinese jail, but the messages on the platform don't escape Beijing's eye. This May, a Canadian security research group found communications between WeChat's overseas users are subject to the same pervasive content surveillance. Because of the app's popularity among overseas Chinese, many Western politicians opened accounts on the platform to engage their Chinese immigrant constituents. In 2017, Jenny Kwan, a Canadian Parliament member, posted a statement on her WeChat. In the post, she praised the young pro-democracy Hong Kong protesters, saying they stood up and fought for what they believe in and for the betterment of their society. WeChat quietly took down the statement. Last year, a BBC reporter posted photos of Hong Kong's Tiananmen Square anniversary vigil on WeChat. His account was later suspended for spreading malicious rumors. He was able to regain his account after the app scanned his face and collected his voice. In a previous statement, Tencent said content shared among international users of WeChat is private and that their policies and procedures comply with all laws and regulations in each country in which they operate. Reporting by Juliet Song, NTD News.
Coming up, May's retail sales report comes as a welcome surprise. Up next, we'll take a look at which sectors performed best. That and more after the break.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people. I'm a little freaked out that that many people have seen my face. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the sole source of edutainment worldwide.
The Commerce Department's May sales report is encouraging. Although it was strong overall, sales are still 8% below where they were in February. Here's a look at some of the highlights.
May's sales boom owes a lot to the automotive sector. It rose by over $30 billion from April and accounts for over 40% of the overall sales increase. Americans also spent more money on their homes. Sales at home and garden centers surged to a record high last month. They're one of just 3 major retail categories, up from a year earlier, along with grocery stores and online retailers. Sales at restaurants and bars shot up nearly 30%, but that only brought the sector back to where it was a decade ago. Clothing retailers increased the most in May, a stunning 188%, but sales are still at just a third of February's level.
And as businesses reopen, they're facing a new challenge, getting sued for someone catching the virus. Some businesses are now using waivers for protection from liability, but workers' groups say it isn't fair on employees.
Many U.S. businesses are asking customers and employees to sign forms saying they won't sue if they get the virus. The liabilities waivers protect businesses in states that don't have any liability limits or immunity from virus-related lawsuits. At least 5 states already have these limits, and more are considering them. But critics say the waivers would allow corporations to skirt safety protocols. And workers' rights groups say the forms force employees to sign away their rights if they get sick. However, in many states, workers risk losing unemployment benefits if they refuse to go back to work because they won't sign.
And Target is raising its minimum wage for employees starting next month. The company says it will benefit hundreds of thousands of its workers. That and more in today's Business Briefs.
Target said today it will raise its minimum wage to $15 an hour, up from $13 starting July 5th. The new threshold applies to 275,000 part-time and full-time employees. It's also giving workers free virtual health care visits until the end of the year, regardless of their insurance plans. Communication Workers of America Labor Union says AT&T will close 250 stores and cut 3,400 staff, as well as 1,300 store workers. AT&T didn't confirm the numbers, but says the cuts were due to customers moving away from legacy products like landlines and in response to the pandemic. To shore up sales volume, U.S. chipmaker Qualcomm is putting 5G technology into chips for lower-end smartphones. Retailing at $300 to $500, it will come to market in the second half of this year. Currently, this next-generation technology is only available to higher-priced phones. Nokia, LG, and Motorola plan to use the chips. U.S. Trade Chief Robert Lighthizer said on Wednesday he wants to ensure that critical medical supplies are made on U.S. soil. He'd like to use tariffs to make that happen. He says he would be, quote, in favor of raising tariffs on things that we need to help make sure we have domestic manufacturing capability in these areas.
And coming up, tips from the FDA on how pet owners can protect their pets from the virus. Find out which animals are most at risk and more after the break. The FDA is warning Americans that while their pets don't spread the CCP virus, infected people can give it to their pets. Some house cats as well as big cats in zoos have been found to be positive.
In a video posted online, the FDA says that cats and ferrets are the most susceptible pets to the virus, but dogs can catch it too. In the video, the FDA also recommends avoiding dog parks for the time being. The 6-foot social distancing rule is recommended for leashed animals as well. The Food and Drug Administration suggests that if you get sick with the virus, you might consider getting a pet sitter if possible. The CDC says the number of infected cats and dogs has been low, but that they like to keep it that way.
That's all for today's news. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Paul Graney.